All right, well, maybe I'll slowly start to get started, even though I know folks are going to be coming in over the next few minutes. But my name is Dylan Hendricks, and welcome to everybody as you're coming in. I am the co-director of IFTF's Vantage Partnership, which is our foundational research program here at the Institute for the Future. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Some of you might recognize me from our 10-year forecast events. We'll be talking more about Vantage and things like that we do in a little bit. Just a little bit about the Institute. This is an ongoing series we do, Ask a Futurist. And this is a series of online conversations that are sponsored by our IFTF Vantage partnership for the public for really trying to help bring our mission to life. The Institute and Vantage have a mission of helping create more literacy around futures thinking and strategic foresight at every level, with public, with our children, with governments, with organizations, and certainly with all of the companies and other groups that we work with. And so we offer these on a regular basis to try to also help bring a lot of this conversation out more into the public, expose more people to strategic foresight, to the various aspects of it, like design futures that we're going to be focusing primarily on today. And yeah, we're just really glad to see such good reception in these maximally uncertain times and to have all these folks with us today. Just a little bit about the Institute for the Future. So if you found your way here, you've probably already gotten some idea of us, but the Institute for the Future, we've been around for just a little over 50 years. We are one of the world's leading futures organizations. We are a nonprofit research organization, as I mentioned, with the mission of helping the world to imagine and have structured conversations around and plan and implement better futures. And so we believe strongly in that mission. All of our work is centered around helping to raise the tide and provide access to all of the boats around moving out of the short-termism that we're kind of culturally and often organizationally incentivized towards, and to be able to step back and look at the world that we inhabit, the systems that we inhabit, look at the possibilities that might be in front of us that we don't necessarily always anticipate on a kind of a linear trajectory. And design futures is a really key part of that. So the Institute has been doing that work for decades. We're both very glad to be a part of that community. And that leads us to our conversation. So as I mentioned, my name is Dylan Hendricks. I do have kind of a media background myself. I do a lot of work with our research teams, but I also do a lot of work with our events and a lot of work creating artifacts from the future, designing with my colleagues around how do we communicate this futures research into something that is palpable and tangible. But I'm very honored to be with my colleague and very good friend, and really one of my most generous mentors as I came into the Institute almost 10 years ago, Jake Dunagan. Jake Dunagan is one of the world's leading design futurists. He has fingers in so many of these pies and has been working on this for a long time. And so welcome, Jake. Always good to be back with you.
Hey, Dylan. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. Look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so let's start at the beginning, just for the sake of the folks that are just coming into this conversation new, and then we'll move into kind of more nuanced waters. But let's start with just like, what is design futures, right? I mean, I think that's got a lot of different kinds of aspects to it and a lot of things people can project onto it. But when you think about what design futures is, what is it at its core for you, and what does it do?
It's good place to start. So it's a combination of design and futures. And we put
okay.
There we go. Thank you. Good night. But it is. I'm gonna tell the story from the futurist point of view. So I come from future studies. Actually have a master's in visual anthropology. So looking at visual culture, representation, those things have been very interesting to me for a long time. And then I got into futures, and what we found from a futures perspective, from foresight, strategic foresight and futures, if you go back to the history of sort of modern foresight, mostly since World War II, you'll find that a lot of great work, a lot of really powerful tools and concepts and methods that have been created and shared, and had a huge impact, from Herman Kahn and his nuclear war scenarios through even population bomb and these kind of visions and limits to growth in the early 70s. So there's a history of this, but and an effective history, but also I think we found that we're not getting the kinds of futures that we had hoped for in some way. Not just a naive "where's my jetpack" thing, but why are so many people suffering? Why can't we manage our business? Why are we staring at the abyss of a potential climate disaster? Why can't we get our shit straight, right? Why are we living in this world? And so from a futures perspective, all this great work and these tools, why are we not connecting? And so part of that story, there's lots of layers to that story, but part of that is, how do you make people pay attention to it? How do you make people care? How do you get over some of the neurological and cognitive biases we have to dismiss things that we don't want to see, we're not prepared to see, that challenges what we already believe? And so the whole incorporation of design and media and performance and artifacts from the future was really trying to connect. How do we bridge the gap between a lived present, which I can feel and touch right now, it's very concrete, or even a past that I have some direct experience from, to a set of possible futures, this cone of ranging complex possibilities and branching things that happen? How do we connect to that abstract space, a space of nowhere that's always going to be out in front of us? And so all of the things we've done from a futures perspective is to try to enhance that capacity for better, as best we can, is to try to connect with people. And so that's why all of these, we've used design. I mean, design is a catch-all, but we use media, we use performance, all of these ways to connect. So it's all about connecting. It's all about making something that's not concrete, simulating a concrete experience so that we can react to it, and then creating an emotional connection to it. So that's the future side. The design side is a little different. I think for designers who are futures creators, they're putting something new into the world. They're imagining and prototyping and fabricating and creating. They're injecting newness into the world. But from a kind of professional designer's point of view, they're often getting briefs or proposals or projects that are already foreshortened for the kind of futures that they want. Don't paint me into a corner and then tell me to design something that's cool for the future. I don't care how beautiful your buggy whip is. It's not really set for the future. So designers have started to incorporate futures tools and techniques and concepts so that they can widen their purview and kind of go, in this case, upstream, so that they're getting the kind of license in their projects to do something that has an impact on the world, and doing speculative futures and critical futures and things like that to interrogate the kind of world that they're designing as well. Not just design nice functional stuff, but really to use design and a design approach to rethink what's possible. So those are the kind of the marriage of these two disciplines, and I think there's a community now that's building, and a community of practice, and a language, and an art, and all of that's developed over the last 15 or 20 years at the most.
Yeah, and these two halves you mentioned, this futures work, this sort of academic, more potentially academic side of it, and then the design aspect of it. In some ways, it seems to me that those two fields kind of discipline each other, right? Like the design, that part, that sort of artistic part of it, sort of is encouraging, as you mentioned, for that intellectual work of thinking about, okay, what is our organizational structure, what is our kind of academic framework, and what does that tell us? Taking us out of that abstract realm and trying to move it more into an imaginative space. And at the same time, that work is also kind of productively constraining our sort of science fiction imaginations, right? So it's not just sort of what can we imagine entirely, but it's like, what can we imagine that is sort of is married to what is also possible, right? Or at least getting to that point, right? And it's not to say that we need those ridiculous kind of ideas that Jim Dator-esque all useful ideas that must at first appear ridiculous to have its place as well.
But you can take a ridiculous idea and put it in a tangible medium, a new warning on a box that you open that says, you give license to your thoughts of your brain if you use this product, right? So you can smuggle in some pretty provocative things, but if you put it in a kind of a familiar vessel or package, you can have that productive cognitive dissonance that we sometimes want to generate. But yeah, it tempers us, but we can still be very provocative. But putting it in a plausible medium also helps do that bridging that we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just a quick housekeeping. I know a lot of folks are sort of piling in. Welcome to everybody who's still coming in. We would love for you to put any, first, as a lot of people are already doing, introduce yourself in the chat where you're from. We would love to see who's here in the room with us. And also, as we're going through, please do put your questions in, and we'll definitely be working on questions that you have for Jake about design futures, different things you're thinking about. We we'll get to that in just a moment. So please make sure those are in there. And while people are thinking about that, Jake, I wonder, just to sort of like bring this to life for folks who maybe are new to the space, I wonder if you could share like an example, one of your favorite examples of a design futures piece that you either worked on or were involved in or just were inspired by, that you thought kind of really moved the needle on that perception space.
Yeah, well, moving the needle is, I always want to be a little bit humble about these things, because I don't. Yeah. It's hard to say what really moves the needle. A couple of things come to mind. I mean, these are favorite projects. I'm gonna mention two to start, and then we can talk about other things. But one was a project we did now 10 years ago with the California Academy of Sciences, and this was the plastic pollution project that we did. So this was the 100th birthday of Jacques Cousteau. It was World Oceans Day, and people knew about it. I'm not saying people didn't know about the Pacific Gyre and the plastic island and all of that. We were aware of it, but I think we're more aware of it now 10 years later. But we were trying to highlight that issue. And one of the things that we're trying to do with design futures and foresight in general is to try to find a doorway in that changes the clicks in a way that other ways don't. So we could talk about, yes, there's a lot of plastic in the ocean, or hey, have you thought about climate change? Yes, right. We don't want to beat people over the head with the obvious, and sometimes things that are really important become obvious. So we need to recapitulate them, to defamiliarize them in a way. So we did this project for nightlife, which is a sort of social gathering. And we thought about the situation, what's the context? What are we doing? Okay, World Oceans Day, Jacques Cousteau's 100th birthday. Plastic, we want to do a project on plastic ocean pollution. So we decided that we would take that timeline, 1910, which was basically the invention of industrial plastic, all the way through and run it forward to 2030. And we, in this case, did a continuation story. What if we did nothing and we just kept dumping plastic in the ocean? So how do we tell that story? Well, we decided to create 4 drinking vessels. So part of our reasoning is that the ocean and water seems different or external to us. How do we see that this is all part of a single system, a water system together? So we had 4 different vessels, drinking vessels, water coolers, glass water coolers, that represented a point in time. So from 1910. 1960, 2010, which was present at the time, and 2030. And we filled them visually with the amount of plastic, sort of a visual representation. So a little piece of plastic in 1910, there wasn't very much. 1960, there was a lot. 2010, there was a whole lot. In 2030, just totally full of it. And so visually, you could see that. Wow, okay, that's really striking, how much plastic, and it's also very gross. Right? This is a drinking vessel, so we would come up and drink out of the water coolers, and people would just look at us, with whatever disgust they could generate for us, and that's a different kind of experience than just talking about or showing charts, which we had data and we had charts and everything. But having that experience versus just showing someone, the amount of pollution or talking about it in numbers, very personal, concrete, very emotional, in the motion of disgust that we used. I always tell us the little trick was that the ceramic bottom was plugged and separated from the top, so we weren't actually drinking water with old straws and film canisters and pantyhose and gross things in there. But that was super effective, and I think it's very indicative of a way that we can speak to not just our cognitive capacity, our intellectual capacity, but our guts, and that's what we're trying to do, is make that emotional connection. And I don't know moving the needle on that particular project, but a lot of people saw it. I think they would think about plastic ocean pollution differently because of that. So the next one, very quickly, was one we did in Chinatown in Hawaii in the late 2007, where we did several scenarios over the course of 3 months on the streets. So this was not contained, this was not a conference, or this was on the streets, and we just sort of put it out there as if it existed. So we had been talking to people in the neighborhood, vendors, and there's an art community there. And the first one we did was basically we call it Mac Chinatown. We took people's fears about the neighborhood becoming just like any other place, with chain stores and gentrifying and all of that. And we basically gave it back to them as if it happened, right? So we put up signage, an empty building, Starbucks coming, or TGI Friday, luxury lofts, bidding starts this. And so we staged a protest against it. We had websites for the development companies, all this, if people wanted to dive deeper. But a lot of details of that. But what stood out to me, was so striking, was that when we did that, the people that were the same people that we had interviewed and talked to, they were saying that this would be the worst thing that could happen. For a few hours on a Friday night, art walk night, we were talking to the same people, and they're like, well, when they believed it, that if that Starbucks is there, yeah, we don't like it, but that will open up this whole block. And now maybe a lot more people will come down to my gallery. The luxury lofts aren't great, but it would be great to have more people living down here at nighttime because everyone goes home or whatever, right? So people completely reoriented their reality when they thought this future, that present was happening, versus what they thought in the abstract. So I found that extremely powerful, that if you can do this right, not trying to fool people or make them, not trying to do disinformation, which we can talk about later. This was really trying to have them have an authentic reaction to a possible future. And I think to do that, when you're using tangible media, people don't necessarily have to believe that this is actually happening. But I think if you hold something or see something, you have a different reaction to it. Just like we're dealing with the reality of today, right? If we talked about this in the abstract, I don't know how we would feel, but we deal with it. So I think it's really powerful when people can have that experience and challenge their own assumptions. One thing that my friend and longtime colleague Stuart Candy and I have said, and it's sort of a mantra for us, is better to be surprised by a scenario rather than blindsided by reality. So that's what we're really trying to do, is to give people these experiences in a relatively safe space so that we can react to them and maybe steer toward the kind of futures we want.
Yeah, that really gets to that specificity piece, right? Mm-hmm. That I know we talk a lot about at the Institute, and our colleague Jay McGonigal talks a lot about that from a neuroscience perspective, right? And which starts to get to some of the questions that I see coming up in the chat around, like, how do you make the case for this kind of work? And so I'll let you think about that seed of when you're trying to, you're working in an academic setting or corporate setting, and you're trying to make the case for why should we invest in design futures work. We can get to that even more later in the conversation, but just teeing off of what you just said, I think one of the things that's really driven home for me as a really firm basis for so much of what we do is just that specificity piece, that people are going to have perceptions about things they've never experienced that are based on very little, right? But those perceptions obviously hold a lot of sway. And there's been a lot of research that if you are just thinking about a future possibility in the abstract, like just off the idea of a concept, then generally we psychologically cannot relate to that future, right? It's like something that's happening to somebody else. And that specificity of being immersed in a setting like you're describing in Hawaii, where you are kind of confronted with the details of the scenario you imagined, and you even just sort of, you can do it in sort of shallower ways, right? Of just like an image, or you can do it in a full in setting or VR or any of these different mediums. But that inhabiting that future possibility just really kind of structurally changes the way your brain engages with it as a possibility, right? And it reminds me, this is a bad thing for a host to do, but just thinking about reflecting on another project that I was involved in with Design Futures that we did with the Institute on the Container project a couple of years ago, right? That was really the goal as well, was we had, with my colleague Toshi Hu in our emerging media lab, we created this VR experience inside of a physical shipping container that we had at our event that year at the 10-year forecast. And the event was designed around the concept of how shipping containers could be leveraged in the future as sort of this kind of resilient, adaptable infrastructure for periods of extreme climate disruption. And so the idea that, oh, I'm going to live in a shipping container is really hard to actually tangibly imagine until you step inside of one in a VR helmet, and you're in this kind of photorealistic-ish sort of interactive environment where you saw that it was like the exact same dimensions where you are. You can touch the walls of the shipping container as you're perceiving it, but you're perceiving it now in the layout of a functional apartment or medical clinic or a farm. And we were invited to bring that to the UN. And I think it just, for everybody that went in there, once you've had an immersive experience, you can't help but think of it as something that kind of happened to you. And so now the possibility of that scenario registers very differently than if you'd just written it on a piece of paper or seen it on a TV show or something, right? And But yeah, I wonder, yeah, what do you think about that kind of specificity, or maybe other ways of thinking about how do folks that are that see the value in the space but are trying to articulate it? What are some other avenues within the methodologies and the rigor of it?
Yeah, and what you're kicking that off with was research showing that when we think about ourselves in the future, say 5 or 10 years, our own selves, the way our brains fire, it looks the same or very similar to the way if we're thinking about a stranger. So our future selves don't feel like us. This was done for, why don't people save money? Why don't you put money away for the future? Well, if you do that, it feels like in your mind that you're giving it away to somebody that's not you. So the idea of specificity, induction, and really sort of putting yourself in that role, in that space. What am I going to be in 10 years? How old am I going to be? Where might I be living? What are my rooms going to look like? How old are my kids going to be? All of those things help. Again, it's the bridging thing. We're prediction engines. Our brains are, to quote Andy Clark, cognitive philosopher. We're running through different scenarios all the time, but we're doing that based on things that have happened to us before, or our own experiences, and all of that. So we're often comically or tragically wrong. Dan Gilbert, another psychologist, talks about how we're terrible at affective forecasting, predicting our own happiness or sadness based on different choices that we make. So getting concrete, bridging that between the kind of present that we feel, even though we're taking leaps and speculations and predictions to the future in our brains, running scenarios, enhancing that capacity and putting more information, getting more information. Instead of guessing whether I'd be happy if I'm CEO of that bank, I'm going to go talk to that person. And if he or she is happy or sad, that's a better predictor of my own happiness than me guessing what that. So getting concrete, getting specific has that kind of effect. I saw somebody in the chat fly by talk about future shock, and that's something that a term of art from Foresight. And a lot of what we do, I've called future shock therapy. So it's sort of sometimes you're kind of shocked by it, but you do it in a way that's in a controlled, safe setting, so that you can internalize that and learn going forward. I think there was another part. I mean, the tricks of the trade for us in doing this are really trying to understand. We think about we have a process that we call experiential futures ladder. So you start with a subject, right? Okay, the United States in 2050. Then you do all the work that we do in futures with our signals that we have and our trend work and all of that, and we go in and we develop a set of scenarios. Okay, we have a set of scenarios. Let's instantiate one of them. Let's take one of those scenarios. Maybe a glorious rebirth of the U.S. Let's put that into a scene or a situation. How do we take that world, and what's our window in? What is that going to be like? Is it a very professional and deep and effective debate between two candidates. So by 2050, we've managed a way that maybe our political discourse has become depolarized, so we can have a window into doing that. And then the last part of the process for us is the stuff. So if we were planning this debate, this sort of idealistic democratic situation, what do we need? What do we actually need? This is where you get down into the stuff. So we need campaign posters, and we need a script for the two candidates to talk. We need a podium, and we need all of those things. So it gets very concrete as we go down from abstract concept, big picture, what are we looking at, to all right, well, we need to narrow down complexity of all the different possibilities into a set of rigorous alternative worlds that we've built out. Now let's instantiate that. Let's create a representation, a feeling where we can interact with it, and then let's actually create the stuff. Which, the interface is the stuff, but then if you go back, down into the stuff, which gets more concrete, the parallax view is just a kickoff point to have a better conversation. So okay, well we've seen this sort of idealized version of democracy. Now what can we do now to make that happen if we want that, rather than something else? And so the action part of that comes out of this. All of that interface of design and the posters and the experience is all just it's the invitation to have a better conversation about the future, and then hopefully to make better decisions along the way.
Yeah, and it just strikes me that that's just so important for us right now. We're at this kind of moment as a planet, right? And I think that's sort of as part of the reason why we have such an international audience is there's so much uncertainty about what the image of the future should look like for where we're going, because we know that there's no precedent for it, right? We've never had this many people. We've never had to adapt to a climate crisis at anything like the scale we've had, or even had that as our framing of thinking in a kind of more systemic way. And so, one of the problems that strikes me in terms of why it's so hard to get traction around, I think, in the climate change debate, is because it is so hard for people to imagine on the one hand, and it's hard for them to imagine where we're going, right? I think so much of the conversation is moving away from something, or trying to retain sort of the status quo, but like in a way that's harder, and where we're, where it's not really a vision that attracts us. And the visions that are out there largely are these very collapsy kind of dystopian ones. And so it just strikes me that this is a huge space that is going to become even more necessary over in this next generation, of putting forth the imagination of where it is that we could imagine trying to go in concrete terms enough to mobilize people around trying to get there, right?
Yeah, it's a point, and maybe I'm late to the game here, but I feel like for a long time of my futures career, and I think especially sort of an environmental point of view, the modality has been in a mode of wake up, maybe even social justice. I don't want to go too far afield with that, but the woke and all that, like, wake up! Look what's happening. We have to stop this. And I think we're awakened. I think climate, the pandemic, social injustice. We're awoken for whatever it's worth, and if you want to fight it, but so I've kind of thought the modality for futures, again, it's always been there in a way, in a thread, but it's from wake up to let's start dreaming. And I think we need a pull, right, and not just an anti thing. Let's not go here, because I think we're left with a limited palette of colors and options right now. I think to me, out of our alternative futures, what we're looking at is either collapse or transformation. So yeah, I think we've envisioned collapse pretty clearly. I think we can see, a million variations of environmental and political and economic collapse. So, I think going hard on transformation is what we have to do. But transformation stories are really hard because it means a paradigm shift. It means it's a different, it's like I'm going to try to imagine a butterfly from looking at a caterpillar. It's extremely hard to do that unless you've seen it, in action. So I think part of our job now, and part of what Design Futures can contribute to this moment, this very fraught, uncertain moment that we're in, is to foreground, offer a set of transformed futures that begin to give us the contours of something that we can work toward, and something we might like. And that has to come from billions, not just the image industry, or not just religion or politics. I think it has to be a very widespread, almost a movement of visioning and changing our perception for that. And so, you see a lot of calls for that. I've even done it myself. Like, let's have a couple of years of truth, reconciliation, and reimagining and reconstituting. Like, let's sort of get out of the present for a little bit, even though I know we're fighting a battle right now for the future, but also not to forget about the pull, and not to instantiate that again, not just an abstract, oh, wouldn't it be great if we all got along? No, but what does it look like? How does it look and feel? Because I think, making people think about the future, you've heard these lines, it's hard to hold two opposing ideas in your head, right? Which I think, it is hard, but how many feelings can we hold? What if we got the feeling of the future right? This is what it kind of looks and feels like, and we don't have to get all of the intellectual details down, but I want to live in a future that feels like that. And if you have kids, or if you've seen the movie Inside Out, emotions are a combo. We can hold not just two opposing ideas. We may be able to hold many, many different emotions together, and for those emotions to sort of pull us forward. So getting the feeling right, I think, is extremely important right now for the future, even more so than sort of the intellectual details of it.
Yeah, that's such an important point. It really makes me think, because like you're saying, I think that's also something that Design Futures offers that is so necessary, is that it provides that space that can help bridge the emotional and the intellectual, which are clearly in such flux right now, right? Where we see a lot of emotional decision making happening, and kind of necessarily so, right? We're all reacting to our own emotions. I know, everybody, we're all talking about this offline about just what an emotional period this is, especially at this particular moment in the US. And I do think Design Futures is sort of, rather than trying to wall off those things that we would sort of erroneously call left, right brain, right, in previous times, but creating a space where those things can productively work together. And one of the things you said, I think, really struck me, which is, and I think it's entirely true, and maybe like such an important thing to reemphasize is that design futures is not so much about just it's not about the artifacts or obviously not the technology, right? Like VR is not a salve for anything or anything like this. It's really about creating a medium that allows a group of people to share a vision together, right? And to collaborate on that vision. And so it's so much more about the people that it's impacting and that who are working with it and who are kind of picking up this literacy and trying to form something that they can share versus just the version of the world we all kind of like sort of churn on in our own minds, which may or may not have any connection to what our agency is or what's actually going on, right? So I think that's something too just because I know I saw some questions earlier about how VR and a lot of it leads with this sort of just the media aspect of it, but it's a people process, right? It actually makes me think a little bit, I know, about the this idea of sort of what do we call it, like the Department of Simulation, something we've talked about before that maybe is worth thinking about bringing forward.
Yeah. The simulation core was an idea.
Simulation core,
bouncing around at IFTF for a long time. Basically, is the idea of what if there's a part of this. What if we reinstituted a draft in this case, U.S. And instead of inducting people into the military, we inducted them into something called the simulation core, where they would play test alternative policies, different approaches, different maybe political structures, ways of doing decision making. And doing that in a simulated environment, taking that as a feedback data point, and then that sort of feeds back on reality. So we know, I mean, this is, the Army does wargaming and things, but doing that at a grand scale, so that we are not always playing catch up and being reactionary. Oh, what if this tax cut? I think we've done some things and we think it's going to work this way. Well, let people play it and see how they're going to game the system. Okay, well, there's an offshore account. I can get out of that easily, right? People might have seen, and I was involved a little bit with something called the Transition Integrity Project about this election, right? So play testing the things that could happen ahead of time, simulating that so that we can prepare ahead of time and be ready to respond different ways. So doing that as a sort of civilizational level, pre-simulation, instead of learning the hard way like we always do. And I mean, this is assuming a political system of goodwill. Like, we're really trying to do that. I know that I acknowledge my naivete on that part of it. People are not necessarily trying to make it better. But if we had a system like that, with all of the benefits of people sort of then having a futures literacy, a greater civic literacy. So there's a lot of other corollary benefits to doing something like that. But yeah, can we install a foresight capacity at enough of a scale that it actually does move the needle, that it does change things? I mean, companies do strategic foresight, organizations do it, we all do it in our different ways. But I think something grander and grandiose and large scale of how we're going to navigate the 21st century, something like that. And I think big thinking like that, whether we can use the tools of gaming, we can use the tools of networks. We don't all have to necessarily be in the same room together doing board games. We can do this much broader. So let's use those tools to siphon off or generate some information from possible futures to feed back on the present, so that we can learn and incorporate that into what we decide and do.
Yeah, there's a question here. Is there a platform or forum where folks who are interested in design thinking and sort of pushing this boulder up the hill can connect with each other and help each other out? Where do you see folks in the design thinking community in any kind of way, like congregating or trying to work together?
Yeah, so there are classes like we have at IFTF, that emerge. There are courses. I teach a course at the California College of Arts. I teach at UT in the design and health. So there's these little nuggets. But I would say the most the one that looks like it's going to be a magnetic attractor is around the Primer Conference and the speculative design meetups. So several dozen places. I just saw one in Montreal, Dylan, for future reference, a speculative design meetup. So those are probably in your city, if not, easily franchised out to do that. So there is a community, some coming out of Royal College of Art and speculative and critical design from Dunn and Raby. They've in New School in New York. And so there's sort of an academic thing. There's also several museums that are emerging. It's just kind of an interesting phenomenon that's happening. So Dylan and I worked on the first iteration of the Museum of the Future in Dubai many years ago. Now they have a physical space. You can Google it and you'll see the amazing 3D printed building that they're creating there. There's a Museum of Tomorrow in Brazil. There's an upcoming exhibition at the Smithsonian with futures and future artifacts and all of that those kind of things as well. So if it's in museums, you know, we're pretty healthy. There's a sort of mainstream movement to using these kind of tools to do that. So, you know, IFTF, we have our courses and hubs there. And I would say the most kind of grassroots way, and probably the easiest entry, is in the speculative design meetups that are happening all over the world.
Yeah, and I see some questions coming by from folks in Mexico City, quite a few. And I know, I think this work is from a few years ago now, but I think it's worth mentioning Gabriella's work, right? Who's one of our former fellows. With the name was the Department of Imagination?
They had a program project, but it was the Laboratorio para la Ciudad, the lab for the city in Mexico City, which was a kind of urban city design speculation. So incorporated a lot of this as well. So yes, there's and I forgot to mention Centro, which I mentor students in the Design of Tomorrow program there as well. Bear's mentioning. So Mexico City has done some really incredible things in design futures and moving into civic spaces. So I've done work with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, where we created a series of posters from the future. We went through a process of uncovering, you know, ideas and assumptions and values and visions of the future from different mayors across the country, including you know, some very more famous ones now than when we were working with them, like Pete Buttigieg, Libby Schaaf, and others. You know, so it is, and the mayor of Dayton, in fact, is using some of these tools, Nan Whaley, to open up you know, conversations with her staff and things like that. So there's a civic aspect to this as well, and it's being incorporated into, you know, into processes in governments and businesses, educational outfits. It's interesting to see museums, as I mentioned, how and where it's grown. It's been quite fascinating. But I think that's because people see the value. I think it's engendering a kind of thinking that's not typical, but is seen as valuable or necessary. We have to break out of our, you know, our sort of habitual assumptions about things, and not just, you know, sort of ornamentally. We need to really focus on that and spend time doing that and do it systematically.
Yeah, and the mayors, the U.S. Conference of Mayors is such a good example. I was really glad to get to help with that as well, and meeting with Mayor Adler and those things. And one of the things that really struck me from that is, you know, that for all of the mayors there, like you said, Pete Buttigieg and Mayor Adler, and you know, I worked with the mayor of Anaheim during that, and that these are folks who are inherently in a position of trying to, you know, create policy and support around future visions, right? It's all future oriented in terms of where are we going, right? What am I going to do in my tenure? What am I promising to do? And yet none of these folks really had any exposure previously to foresight, to design futures. And so you could really sense that kind of, like, for one, just, you know, there's that initial kind of like unfamiliarity with it, but then like pretty quickly, like a hunger, they're like sort of recognizing, as you say, the value of it. I think, and particularly in this era now where I think, you know, when I first started the Institute almost 10 years ago, I think there was a general sense across different organizations and groups that the future had been so stable for a few decades relatively, right? This kind of like institutional models we were carrying forward in many cases from like the 19th or 18th century, but certainly from World War II, that like everybody assumed that there was sort of linear progress moving forward. Maybe the widgets get cheaper and better, but we spent a lot of effort, I remember, framing those futures conversations around, imagine what if it wasn't all the same. And just in the last few years, it's flipped on its head. I think the perception of everybody that I talk to at these different organizations, wherever they are, is everybody assumes it's not going to be the same. And there's this kind of, this real sort of deep uncertainty, right, that's sunk into like all of our bones and comes out of all of our pores now, that we actually can't very well imagine what the future will be like. We know it's got to be different. I think even recognizing it's got to be transformational on a personal level, it's not hard to get people there, right? But then, okay, so how do you, in a serious structured organization with different incentives, like talk about futures that we knew we need to move towards, but have never experienced until now? Right. And so having a tool set that starts to get at that, I think people just that youth conference in Marys, it was so striking how so many of them were like, oh, where has this been all my life, right? Just in the taste of it they got of this few days at South by Southwest.
Yeah, that's a great point, and kind of a restatement of the point about waking up versus dreaming, or the need for that, and transformational dreaming. It's like before it was like, things are going to be different. We swear things are going to be different. Get ready, they're going to be different. Now that everything's different, like, what are they going to be? Like, what do I have? What anchor do I have to even think about the future? And so that's the whole idea that we need to do that, but do it in a systematic way, because everyone's at sea. If you've not had foresight training or anything at all, you're like, whoa, what am I? Okay, yeah, I get it. Nothing's the same, but how do I think about the future? How do I do it in a systematic way that I can feel confident that I'm doing, doing something that has rigor or backing to it? And that's what we're trying to do. All these fancy, beautiful, provocative things that we create are doorways in to having that conversation. Okay, I've got you. You're in what my friend and colleague Matt Jensen, a designer, calls uptime. I'm ready. You've got me. I'm in. Now what? And so I think being also just as systematic, which we are, about that now what question. Let's lead you through a very careful conversation about trade-offs and what you want, and some of the structural limitations, and how do you manage that, and what people in your organization do you start to marshal, and forces and resources. So we go from foresight to insight to action. It's the IFTF mantra plan, but you can't really go to action without the insight, and you can't really generate the insight unless you've sort of opened your mind to different perceptions.
Right. So just that tool for opening our minds broader than we're used to doing, right? And obviously we also have our community that we're, this is a big part of it at the Institute here for Futurist thinking, and that's what we do and what we connect with. And we use different terms for it, so we align around sort of design futures and strategic foresight. I'm also just thinking, because we've used a few other terms, it might be nice to kind of cover, like, so you mentioned speculative design. So in terms of people who are trying to do their Google foo on finding things, maybe resources, if they're not close to us, or what are other kinds of terms you think that are in the orbit of this space around folks that are trying to find the magnets, and what are the ones that aren't, right? Like, what is design thinking and design futures? I know that's like a whole webinar in itself, but there's a lot of adjacencies to this space as well, right?
Right. Yeah. So as I said, the terms and the community of practice are coming into a little bit clearer view than they were, say, 5 or 10 years ago. But from a design point of view, in fact, over 10 years ago, we had a conference at South by with Bruce Sterling, who was one of the early advocates or espousers of this, and he called it design fiction. So folks like Julian Bleecker at the Near Future Labs, Stuart and I were working, Jason Tester at the Institute for the Future back in 2005, 2006, very inspirational in creating artifacts from the future. So there's a design side. Generally, I'm overgeneralizing, but design fiction was a term. And then from the future side, we called it experiential future. So we were trying to highlight the immersive experiential part of it. Yes, we create products and all these things and flags and all this stuff, but it's really about the experience. It's really about the connective piece with the future. Since then, the Dunn and Raby program was speculative and critical design. It has a big overlap with what we do. So it kind of coalesced. I think the biggest catch-all term is design futures. That's why we call it what we do. So it has some of those design elements. Design thinking, I would say, is a separate strand. Any thinking systematically using a design approach, yes, that's there's part of that there. But I think it's in the orbit. But I would say that if you wanted to Google design fiction, sort of a corollary to science fiction, using design as a way to manifest it, experiential futures, immersive futures, and then design futures, I guess, is sort of where it seems like things are starting to coalesce. Speculative design also.
Yeah, and there's a lot of questions actually coming in, and I just opened the Q&A panel too, and so I see a lot in there that I can tell just from looking at the time. We're not necessarily going to be able to get to all of them, but a theme that I'm seeing in a lot of the questions is people trying to get started in this space, right? And so they see it, they've had that wake up moment, they get the need for this, and So where do you think people should start? And I think you can kind of segue from that, because obviously a lot of the Design Futures course that you teach with Jock and with others at the Institute has built itself around trying to answer that question, right? How do people get started? And so you've got this multi-day course that the next one's coming up in May. And so that might be a resource people are interested in. But just in general, where do you think people should get started? And how do you approach that in the Design Futures course?
Yeah, this should be accessible. Well, I mean, it's just like Futures, right? I mean, we all can do this, and we all can get better at it. And you don't have to be a designer. I'm not a designer at all. You should see the sketches I've used. So I've always worked with filmmakers, designers, media creators. I'm more of a social scientist than a designer per se. So there is an army of people that are good and interested in doing projects generally, and paid sometimes or inspired. I think some of my best work has been done on a sort of pro bono basis. But I think there is a market out there for this. Talk to other people, go to the meetups, take the courses, right? There's a Coursera course that we have that has an Experiential Futures module in it. There short courses that are popping up that the University of Houston has a more of a foresight lens. But I find that doing get a little basis. Do the Coursera maybe or some other courses as well, but go talk to other people that are working in this space and look at the examples. There's writing now. Stuart Candy and Sherry Potter co-edited a double journal of the Journal of Future Studies on Design and Futures, which has a host of great resources. So we have a lot more resources now. I mean, when Jason Tester and me and Stuart and Julian Bleeker and everybody was kind of doing this in the late 2000s, we were kind of making it up on our own as we went and learning by trial and error. Well, a lot of that error has been incorporated and learned from, and we have now a kind of a canon, a way of doing things. So read the work that's out there. Go to IFTF, look at some of the posts that we've made. Go to Stuart's blog, read about it, talk to other people that are doing it. There's also, I'll just mention a card game called Thing from the Future that Stuart and a guy named Jeff Watson created. You can find that at Situation Lab at Carnegie Mellon, which is Stuart's outfit. And there's a digital version of this, but it's a simple process. So you can you can do the whole Experiential Futures ladder and take months to do projects. You could also start creating artifacts from the future by putting 3 different prompts together. So what we did, we created this for U.S. Conference of Mayors. So imagine in an overcrowded city, there is a sign, I'm doing this randomly, related to equality. What is it, right? So you can fast track to some of this kind of thinking very quickly with just a few prompts and start generating ideas. So it doesn't take months of coursework or writing dissertation level things. It's really see what's out there, see what's done, know your purpose and your audience. But if you want to do it playfully, then things like this exist as well.
To build that muscle, yeah. So if people do want to take your course, because you've put together an original Design Futures course with Jacques Barcia from Brazil. So what would people, just to sort of also think about, if there are a lot of people in here might be interested in that, what would they expect from that, and what do people kind of, what's their journey through that look like? What do they come out with?
Yeah, so I have a toolkit right here. So what we do is lead you through a process which provides some basis in foresight, so you wouldn't have had to have any futures work per se. So when you give you at least the basics, an intro to futures thinking, how do we think systematically and effectively about the future? And then we go through the futures, experiential futures ladder. So we'll work on how to do world building. How do we flesh out a world? How do we create stories? How do we manifest alternative futures? And then the next step is to take that world and how do we instantiate that into an experience. And so we have another set of tools, all of these 8 tools in total in our course. So two to get you a baseline of futures, 2 to help you with world building, 2 tools to help you to take that world and manifest it and represent it into a scene, into something that you can experience, an immersive experience, or a way of creating an artifact or an experience. And then how do you put it in those things into action? How do you use these these experiences or these artifacts as jumping off tools or doorways into thinking about, okay, how do I act on that strategically, or in my work, what do I do with it? So that's the again, it's sort of a recapitulation of foresight, insight, action, but with a heavy emphasis on that creating that experience, creating that interface with the future that we find so effective.
Yeah. So I know we've got to wrap up soon. I want to fit in as many of these little questions as we can in before. So just one that's sort of popping up for me that you might be able to speak to just quickly is thinking about, there was a question about, I think a lot of people sort of have become aware of design thinking. And so if you were to like, just in a paragraph's worth, sort of this, what is the difference between design thinking and design futures? Where are they similar? Where are they different? If you're going to try to like help cleave the separation there.
Yeah. I don't. So I'm not going to speak authoritatively to design thinking. So people that are in that world may be off, but it's design thinking is a way to understand the context of which you're designing in, starting with empathy and all of that, really to understand the kind of world that you're designing into, and then prototyping, getting feedback, learning from that, and improving the output for what you're doing. So I always thought of it, again, I'm sort of, maybe it's a stretch, it's kind of a scientific method, right? You start with observation, you have sort of a hypothesis of how this might work. You go out, you experiment with it, you take that feedback, you learn, and then you take it to the next step. What are those new experimental observations? How do they change what you're doing? So it's an iterative learning process. In that way, I think the way that I'm describing it there is not dissimilar from design futures, in that we are putting speculative possibilities into the world. We're kind of, instead of sort of observing, a sort of natural state and then making a hypothesis about it, we're kind of throwing something into the mix, seeing how people respond to that, and then there's a creative leap part of that. What do you want to do with it? What do you want to build now after that? So it's not just describing reality or building. It's really trying to put people in a state of mind where they can make better decisions and create the kind of worlds that they want. So sometimes an injection of the future, even a provocative one, or a non-preferred future in most cases, that's generally the case. It's not something you want, but you can respond to that. So we're kind of artificially creating an experimental moment to learn from, and then take that forward.
Yeah, that's great. And just last question I'm going to try to squeeze in here is, I think it's a really good one, which is around like, how do you do this on a budget, right? So if it's like, it's one thing I think we can all imagine.
It would be easier for me to answer.
Yeah, well, exactly. Like we can imagine like, okay, I'd love to hire a film crew. I've got a movie in my head, or I'd love to hire a VR team. But for folks like most of us, and most of the situations we're in most of the time, and I think about the snake dog leash, obviously. So I would like tee that up a little bit, but like, how do you think about that? What does it take? What's the minimum viable design futures that can be meaningful?
Yeah, you can go so far with very little. There's a quote from Peter Morville said, sometimes it's better to invite contributions with a disturbing whole rather than to basically thwart conversations with a pacifying whole, H-O-L-E. So a disturbing whole sometimes opens up conversation rather than a pacifying whole, W-H-O-L-E. So you use that. You have to understand where you are and what you're trying to get out of it, and you don't need a giant budget. You don't need super high production Hollywood production values. So you mentioned the snake dog leash, which is one of my favorite practical tips for doing this. So we did a transformation story where there was sort of genetic engineering, and there was you could download stuff to your brain in this particular future. So we were like, okay, let's kind of fill the environment with stuff that would be in that world. So tourism posters to Mars, and a menu of chlorophyll injections you could get, so you don't have to eat, you can get from the sun. Anyway, so this is kind of it's very transformational in that way. But one of the things that we were thinking about, well, kids are going to want maybe there's these like Build-A-Bear, and you could sort of push buttons and have a genetically hybrid animal that a kid will have for a pet. Like, okay, well, yeah, how do we make a snake dog? If a kid wants a snake dog, how do we do that? Well, we can't really genetically engineer that. If we tried to fabricate something, it would look really fake. So what we did instead was put a leash with a little tiny collar on it, and said snake dog leash, 20 credits. So, okay, all of a sudden, oh yes, I guess this world has snake dogs because they have snake dog leashes, right? So those kind of tricks are really effective for spurring imagination without having to show everyone everything, because you can't, right? I mean, if we're in a transformed world, there are things we can't make a teleportation machine, but we could show you the a warning sticker on something that will tell you about that. When I assign students to do films, if you can't do a full what looks like a commercial, like a real fancy commercial on TV, what else could you do? Well, you could do Blair Witch kind of handheld thing, right? Make your scenario work for what your capacities or your budget are as well, and you can get very creative about that. Or it's closed caption television, right? So yeah, that's why it looks grainy, So you have to. It's a full-bodied kind of endeavor that we do, and you have to think about your audience. You have to think about what resources and timing you have, but you can be very creative. I mean, I've got some postcards on the wall here. We created those for a tourism project in Hawaii, and yes, we had a designer and we worked a lot, but they're postcards, right? It doesn't take a $1 million budget to create very effective experiences or artifacts.
One of my personal favorites made by our colleague Nick Weidinger for our 10-year forecast event a few years ago was we wanted to tell a story and create a provocation around the idea of smart toilets that can sense your organic matter, right? And get health information about you, get information about your microbiome, identify you that way. And so obviously we can't create a smart toilet, but at our venue in the site where we were hosting the event, which was on this aircraft carrier as it happened, we had these just warning signs, just super easy to make up. You can make them in Word or whatever, that were just warning people that, like, by using this toilet, you agree that the county of Alameda can identify you by this and mayor. It's sort of like the warning you're on camera things that are on the metro, and put them up there. Don't tell people that they're up there. Don't really tell people that they're fake, right? Make it ambiguous. You have to look at the date that it's from 2035 in order to see that it's there. But it creates a space where people are wondering, like, wait, is this real? Is this a thing? Is this possible? How would this be possible? And it just just from the simple sign, right? The possibility space cascades out from there and prompted a ton of conversation around this idea that was probably more effective than if we tried to create something that had like bleep bloop lights and was pretending to be a smart toilet, right?
Yeah, the marginalia. Just think about genres that are around you. What is communicating? In your world, and think about all of those as your palette for doing different things. And I love the signage or the official posters or the little small font writers that are on different documents and things like that. Those things I find are extremely effective.
Yeah. So I know we're close to time here, so just wanted to just talk a little bit about sort of other resources. So obviously we have another one of these free public webinars coming out in just a little bit here, November 18th, on the future of the family with the Family Story Project. This is a culmination of work we've done looking at how this changing social institution is transforming in our world. The design Futurist class, the next one is in May for folks that are interested in that. Jake mentioned Coursera. That's available at all times to folks. It's very accessible to get a taste of our work here. And then just a little bit about Vantage too. So Vantage is our foundational research program, especially for folks working for large organizations that want to do this work. We offer Foresight training from our Foresight Essentials program, which includes the Design Futures class. And we offer, this is our partnership for helping folks build capacity for future readiness, which includes working on building the capacity of these methodologies, working on the sort of assessment of where you're at, building that capacity through things like our signal scanning platform, Future Factors, all of these things. So please, if you have any interest in that, please do check us out at our website, IFTF.org, to see the work that we do there that also funds these kinds of events and this kind of our community. Oh, we need to see a dog at the end of, the internet is not a safe place these days without animals on it. That's how you know you're on the right side of the internet. So thank you again so much, Jake. I love you, brother.
Thank you.
And we are in this together, and I thank you everybody so much for joining us and for joining this conversation. Please continue in this conversation. How do we imagine better futures and then build those better futures together? So thank you so much all for joining us. Apologies to the questions we didn't get to. Obviously we had a lot of activity and interest in this, and so we'll do more of it. And yeah, stay safe and sane out there.
Aloha, y'all. Good luck.